Hello, Humane marketers. Sarah Znakrocha here. Welcome to another episode of the Humane Marketing Podcast, a place to be for the generation of marketers who cares. This is the show where we talk about marketing your business in a way that feels good to you, is aligned with your values, and also resonates more with your conscious customers because it's not pushy, ethical, and also beautiful. So if you're a regular here, you know that I'm organizing the conversations around the 7 Ps of humane marketing. And if you're new here and this is your first time, welcome. I'm so excited you're here. You may want to download your one-page marketing plan with the 7 Ps of humane marketing in the form of a mandala at humane.marketing/one page, the number 1 and page. So again, humane.marketing/one page. And with that, with no further ado, let's dive into today's conversation. Hi, Bill. I'm so looking forward to our conversation. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Humane Marketing Podcast.
Thanks, Sarah. And I am so delighted to be with you and looking forward to it myself.
Yeah, so we're going to go right deep into it as we do as highly sensitive people, and also as introverts. I find that we like to go deep. And so that's really also the topic of our conversation, to talk about high sensitivity in business and what that means. And you identify as a highly sensitive male. So I'm really curious to hear the story about when you found out that you are a highly sensitive person and what that meant, like what changed when you found that out and learned more about what this trait is all about. So can you take us there and tell us a bit?
Sure. I think my whole life I've known there's something different about me. I grew up in a very traditional part of the United States, and where male masculine role models were set in stone, so to speak, and you had to follow along. And I found a lot of times it was hard for me to do that. And I knew there was something different about it. But this was way before Dr. Erin had published her book on high sensitivity. And it was probably just kind of in the sort of very formative stages with some of the other research that was going on about high sensitivity in children and so forth. But I had no navigational tools for that. And so I spent most of my life adapting myself to what men were expected to be like. And that was kind of going against my authentic self. But nevertheless, pressed on, because that was the pressure that I think a lot of men find themselves under, is trying to project this masculine side that doesn't allow for some of these other things that we term as sensitive. Probably about mid 2005 or 2006, somewhere around there, I found Dr. Erin's book. It was actually somebody had sent me a newsletter, and it was about high sensitivity, and they had recommended the book highly. So I picked the book up and I read it. And I think like most highly sensitive people, I went to the book and said, yep, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me. And it resonated with me because it was the first time in any one particular place that I had seen so many of the things, characteristics, and traits that I have enumerated and explained in one place. And so it really did make a lot of sense to me. But there is this problem. As a male, I was having a difficult time grasping, endorsing, and believing that I was, quote unquote, a sensitive man. And that was kind of the difficult point for me. Even though I knew and acknowledged that all these characteristics did fit me, the term sensitive was just something that kind of was like a roadblock for me mentally. And it honestly took me, Sarah, about 10 years of mulling this over, because it's kind of very much like a highly sensitive person anyway, is mulling this over and over in my head until probably about 2016. I started writing a blog about it. I thought this would be a good way of me putting my hand around it and doing a little research and understanding. And so I wrote a blog for a couple of years. And I just hit all the topics that I wanted to know about as a highly sensitive man. And by doing that, it was a way of allowing me to embrace and get answers for questions I had. And then eventually, as a result of writing the blog, I wrote my first book, Confessions of a Sensitive Man. And that's when I put it all together. And I think at that moment, this was a couple of years ago, at that moment that I was doing that, I finally really started to say, you know what, this is who you are. And there's nothing to be ashamed of. And this actually is quite a gift. And so that's when the love came, where I started wrapping my arms around being a sensitive man and saying, this is who I am, and I'm not going to apologize for it anymore.
Right.
And that was a kind of a eureka moment for me. So it was like the initial onset, in the early 2000s, a 10-year period of struggling with it. I think a lot of men do have that problem. And it's funny because it's not necessarily the trait, it's the label that we give the trait that was a lot of men struggle with. And they kind of reject it. Yeah.
It's interesting because I feel like, I guess the experience is, in this case, very different between men and women, because the women, yes, there's some of that as well, right? The criticism, oh, you're just so sensitive, and
Right.
But it's more probably seen as something positive in a woman, where you're right, it's more negative in a man. I remember reading this line that you said that your father told you, "Are you a man or are you a mouse?" So it comes with this traditional upbringing and the idea that we think, well, men have to be strong and the opposite of, sensitive. So I guess the experience is very different, even though there might be struggle also with being in a female body, experiencing being a highly sensitive person, but it's very different. Let's look at, besides the term sensitive, let's look at the trait by itself. Like, there's a lot of listeners on this show that don't know what a highly sensitive person, what that means, right? It just, maybe that's just a term that we came up with, and we think, oh yeah, I'm very sensitive to certain things, but it's actually a personality trait. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Certainly. Highly sensitive people, or high sensitivity, is the scientific name for it is called sensory processing sensitivity. And that's a mouthful. Most people are used to the terminology high sensitive, but sensory processing sensitivity is kind of the theory. And this is the thing that Dr. Aaron has been expounding for the last 30 years. Sensory processing sensitivity is part of a larger theory called environmental sensitivity theory, and it has many different models underneath it, one of which is sensory processing sensitivity. And what environmental sensitivity theory is addressing is, how does the organism react to the environment they're in? It's basically an environmental reaction to various environmental stimuli and so forth. Sensory processing sensitivity individuals fall on a spectrum of sensitivity, right? And you think of a bell curve, right? Something we all remember from high school math. And at the very top end of this bell curve, which is really a curve about how sensitive people are within the environment they're in, okay? The 20-25%, and now I'm hearing as high as 30% of human population has this trait of sensory processing sensitivity, okay? That doesn't mean that the other 80% don't have it. It just means simply that those people at the high end experience environmental changes more pronounced. And so if it's a positive change, they react positive. If it's a negative change, they react negatively. And the people that fall on the other 80% react in a much more different way. And they've got it divided into three groups. The ones on the least end are called, and they use a flower metaphor, which I think most people could understand. Dandelions are on the low end. They're very hardy. They can adapt very well, easily, and less sensitive to the environment. Tulips are in the middle. They're a little hardier than, say, the highly sensitive people are, but still, nonetheless, they are affected by the environment as well. And then there's the orchids, which is what they call the highly sensitive people. Now, with all that said, what I'm trying to say by this is that, yes, there are individual characteristics that we acknowledge for highly sensitive people, but it's a much broader thing than you're just overly reactive to things, or you're just too emotionally sensitive, or you're too impacted by criticism, or you're too frail. It's much more than that. What the outside world sees when they see those things in us is the reaction that we're having to environmental changes around us, okay? And so it could be sensory environmental stuff, it could be emotional stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's 4 characteristics, all right, that we recognize now for highly sensitive people. And you can use the acronym DOES, D-O-E-S. And D stands for depth of processing. Highly sensitive people have this capacity to take data, information, and process it at a very deep level. That means they connect dots, they push things together. Sometimes it leads to overthinking, surely, but for the most part, you wind up with a very creative output if given the time and the space to do this deep processing that high sensitive people do. That's why so many highly creative people are highly sensitive, because they have this capacity to do this. The O stands for overstimulation, which is something that happens as a result of getting too much data in and having too much processing you have to do.
Yeah.
That's something that a lot of people see, and the term that comes out is you're too sensitive, or being sensitive makes you weak, but that's not true. If you were getting the kind of data that we get, typically on the high end of the sensitivity scale, it would be overwhelming for most people too, especially if you're doing all this processing with it as well. So it does get overwhelming at times. So that's a characteristic. E stands for emotional reactivity. This is another thing that people tend to associate with highly sensitive people, is we feel deeply, very deeply. We feel emotions at a very deep level. And that a lot of times appears to people to be overreacting, but in fact, it's simply just the way we process emotional information. The other part of the E is empathy. We're extremely empathetic people. We care about people. A lot of us are in the helping professions, or doing things that help people, because that's where our heart is. We're very empathetic individuals. And it's not, I don't know the exact physical mechanism that causes, there's a thing we refer to as mirror neurons that we all have, whether you're sensitive or not, that allows you to mirror back to the person you're with as a communication establishing link, right? So I don't know whether highly sensitive people have more mirror neurons, or they have more finely defined and tuned mirror neurons. I don't know, but the fact is it's very important and part of that empathetic part of us. Also can make us a little naive sometimes in trusting people. So it can be
my hand here.
Yes, it could be a two-edged sword. The last thing is the sensory part of it. Dr. Aaron calls it sensing the subtle in the environment. And I'm not sure that our sensory organs are more powerful or whatever, but I do think the filters that pass that information on are more open with us. I like to think of it like an aperture in a camera. Ours is a little bit more open, or maybe a lot more open, depending on who we're comparing ourselves to. But it passes a lot of stuff to us. So the metaphor I always use, the analogy I always use, is if you're walking into a party, a highly sensitive person will be that person who notices that the music may be too loud, that there's someone with perfume or cologne on the other side of the room, it's too powerful. Or it could be something like we sense a vibe in the room because looking at body cues and things like that. We sense those things. We pick out that nuanced information. And that makes us kind of valuable when you're talking about one of the greater purposes for highly sensitive people is to serve as kind of a canary in the coal mine, is to serve as a kind of an early warning system. So all 4 of those characteristics are the ones that are scientifically evidence-based characteristics. Now, a lot of people will talk about other stuff. Those are the 4 main ones, and I like to kind of stick with those because we do know that there's evidence for them.
So much in what you just shared, and it's kind of it's funny because my brain is almost like overstimulated right now by listening to these different concepts. But I think what would help also here is to give some specific examples So I can give one because I just, experienced a 4-day workshop that I attended after not being anywhere in person, any kind of in-person event. So I went to this 4-day workshop, 50 people. And I knew as an HSP, you kind of know already in advance, you're like, oh my God, this is going to be a lot. How am I going to deal with this? I hope I'm not going to get sick because of the overwhelm. So this is a very specific example where, as a highly sensitive person, you need to kind of know your boundaries. You need to know when you want to be engaged and when you want to have alone time, because you do need this extra processing time. And I admit that I'm not there yet. Like, I still had very bad nights of sleep because it was just so much information. I'm not just talking about the content, but just even meeting all these new people. My brain needs just to analyze everything. And that's that deep processing that then often, unfortunately, takes over, instead of sleeping. And so that's a specific example that I can think of right now. What example could you share, Bill?
Well, I think that's a great example. It can be very easily generalized to just about every highly sensitive person. Now, although most highly sensitive people are introverts, 70% or so, there's still 30% that are extroverts.
Yeah.
So you would think the extroverted, highly sensitive people would thrive in an environment where they're out meeting and greeting people and going like that. But the reality is they still have to have that downtime. So those things that you were talking about, that's always been something that I've had challenges with, is getting out there trying to do something new or try to do something that is not familiar for me.
Right.
And having to process all this kind of data that feedback data that I'm getting about how I'm doing. A lot of that may be coming from me. It may be coming from people that I'm working with or people that I'm around. But that seems to be one area, especially with highly sensitive people, that I think can be generalized to just about everybody in this category, is because at some point, you're right, you get out there, you're trying something new, and you have to allow yourself the time to do this downtime, this assimilation process of doing things. That's one of the things with highly sensitive people too that I think is kind of problematic. Is one, there's a lot of people out there who are highly sensitive who don't know it, or they have never heard of highly sensitive. I've talked to people all the time, and as I'm talking to them, they go, I think I'm highly sensitive. And suddenly you see the light bulb go on. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the problem, is getting people to embrace and understand the trait. And the other part is, once you understand it, now you have an understanding because you got a framework to work with, is how do you deal with these times when you are overwhelmed? How do you deal with those times when you're out in the public eye or you're in a social function or whatever? What is it that you need to, how do you do that? You said something really great about boundaries too, because highly sensitive people almost have this kind of loose boundary system that allows too much in sometimes, and in some cases allows the wrong people in who can cross over these boundaries that we should be setting up, and it causes an emotional effect on us. So part of it is learning to deal with the characteristics, because there are challenges to this, but it's still, on whole, is this great and wonderful gift. And that's part of doing that, part of assimilating that, is the idea of, how do I deal with those moments when I struggle, when I'm overstimulated, or I'm feeling too deeply and it's not the appropriate time. How do I regulate myself? So those are kinds of things that I think highly sensitive people need to learn to be able to do, because those kind of experiences you're talking about happen all the time, especially to highly sensitive people.
I feel like the struggles, so the things where we need to learn how to deal with having that trait, that's kind of what we focus on, because we don't really understand how we would be if we didn't have the trait. Right. And we don't know how much it brings to us. So you mentioned, for example, as a positive, it's connecting the dots, or, sensing the room and then making adjustments. To me, that is just so natural that I listen and then I go, oh, okay, here's the answer.
Right.
That I don't know how it would be if I didn't have the trait. So that doesn't necessarily come out as a positive to me. What I do see, though, is how society is not meant, or, quotation marks, for HSPs. And so it always feels like, oh, I need to fight against a system. So yeah. Do you recognize yourself in that?
Absolutely. And I think part of it, again, is when I visit a lot of social media groups where they're talking about high sensitive topics, very often, I think what's happening is a lot of people who are new to the trait are coming online with it. And naturally, you want to go someplace where you've got other people like yourself. But the focus tends to be on, I won't say necessarily the negative side, but certainly the challenges. And the focus seems to go there, as opposed to saying, how do you deal with it? Or how do I cope with this? And a lot of people do jump in. And that is what's great about the support side of that. But the idea ultimately is to say, okay, this is a wonderful gift. And like most wonderful gifts, there's a price you have to pay for having it. It's just a kind of a balancing thing with it. And I think as highly sensitive people, we need to learn these little strategies, these tips and things. And none of this is complicated. I mean, it's just is putting them all together in the framework of who you are as a highly sensitive person. And when you do that, you start to realize, I could do this breathing exercise that can calm me down, or I definitely need to go somewhere for 25, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, and just calm down and relax and process. Once you understand that's part of your normal wiring, that's how your brain works. It's not a dysfunction. Then you approach it differently because you see it in a different light now. This is how I'm constructed. Right?
Yeah. So good. To kind of stay with the positive sides, how do you think can we be more sensitive in business, and what kind of role do we get to play as highly sensitive people in this, I call it the new business paradigm, kind of the post-COVID? To me, that is the beginning of the new business paradigm. So how does that look like, and what can our role be?
I think we have a very significant role to play, not only in business, but in all aspects of life. But let's focus on business because, frankly, most of us spend most of our life doing some type of business, whether we're running a business, a small business, or we're part of a large corporate environment or large company or whatever. And I think highly sensitive people can have positive effects on both environments. It may be a little more difficult, and I keep hearing this over and over again, that for highly sensitive people, very often doing the entrepreneurial thing is more conducive to setting the environment that you need to have in order to be happy and thrive. But it does have its own challenges because you're the boss. You're the one who has to make everything work. And if you've got employees, you've got to make it work for them too. In the corporate environment, it's a little more challenging because it's more confined. You can only do so many things and so forth. But I think from a corporate perspective, highly sensitive people can start having an impact on how the environment is constructed, because that's so important to us, right? What kind of seating situation there is. Is there good lighting? Is it too hot or too cold in there in the environment? Or is there too much noise, too many distractions, et cetera, et cetera? And there's some things probably that we could detect and participate in trying to evolve the environment we're working in a more empathetic way, and looking at how we treat others within the environment, especially within management and within areas where you're leading people, right? On the entrepreneurial side, I think this is really where we can shine, because frankly, we can define a business that is successful and yet still adheres to, and I love the term you use, the humane part of business. This part of business, unfortunately, seems to be getting further and further away from us. And I really think what's happening, COVID being a great example, is that's opened up sort of the box here, Pandora's box, if you will, opened up that box, and we can look at what we do and how we do things. Mm-hmm. And that can help. HSPs can be instrumental there as well by saying, these kinds of things are more conducive to my better work environment. It probably will be so for other people as well. Not necessarily everybody, but it will. There's certain things, kindness in business, it's not always about competing. Sometimes it's about cooperating so that everyone benefits from something. These are the kind of concepts that are dear to highly sensitive people because of our empathetic nature and our wanting to be good stewards, not only of our environment, whether it's work environment or whether it's our life environment. But that's some of the things I think that highly sensitive people can do to affect change. And your good ideas and your good thinking, and all those things are important, but we tend to be wallflowers when it comes to participating in that way. We don't feel like our ideas are good enough. We don't feel like they're going to be accepted. And this is where we need to start recognizing, again, our strength and where that is in terms of what we bring to the table. That being able to observe things that other people are missing means that we may have to work a little harder to get that point across, but it doesn't make it less valid because nobody else has seen it yet. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we're the first ones to see it. And I think in both entrepreneurial world and corporate world, I think those things are valuable characteristics to be able to be a good creative problem solver and be very empathetic and intuitive.
Yeah, when you said we are sometimes the first ones to see the problem and others don't see it yet, that definitely resonates with me with my journey from gentle marketing to humane marketing, and only now really people are like, oh yeah, that's exactly what we need. We need a humane marketing revolution. But 2, 3, 4 years ago, I started talking about that, and nobody. I was like, "Hello, I'm all by myself here," and it's Again, I would kind of say, well, it's a gift, but it's kind of a hidden gift because I really felt alone. But I agree with you that those are the mavericks that we need to bring the change, right? Otherwise, nothing changes if nobody sees the new things that need to be brought in. So, definitely.
And sometimes it's not just seeing something new, but it's also seeing something that's missing. Mm-hmm. Like a puzzle piece that's not there yet, and being able to recognize that that's not, maybe a standard way of doing things at this point, but needs to be because it's missing, right? That's what I love about this humane marketing and humane sales and things that you have written about, is because that's the framework we need to be operating under. And if we're going to really shift the way business looks at things and how business interacts with the environment, at the fundamental core level, it has to be more human. It has to be about protecting all of us. And I think that it starts with that kind of, shall we call it, sensitivity to what's going on in the business world. Yeah.
Now, Bill, you kind of know the story, the transformation from gentle, the word gentle that I used before, to then switching to humane. And I found it interesting, kind of the resistance I got mainly from the male audience to the word gentle. Everybody else kind of loved the word gentle, but a lot of men, well, either they were not attracted to it at all, or if they were, they're like, yeah, it's not a great word. And so the minute I changed it to humane, a lot of more men are now showing up and saying, yeah, that is interesting to us. So what are your thoughts on this? How come we can be sensitive, I guess, to words, just like we said before, highly sensitive people, men are like, ooh, I don't know, I don't want to be that. You think it's the same with the word gentle?
Exactly. I'm absolutely positive it is. Although, it's a lot of men don't have the problem being called a gentleman, right? A gentleman, right? They don't have a problem with that, but they do have a problem with it. If you were to cut the word in half and say gentleman, they might find that a little different
Right.
to take, and assimilate. But
Yeah.
yeah, when we talk about things like sensitivity and why it's so hard especially for men, but it's hard for a lot of people too, because if you've been labeled your whole life as being too sensitive, and that's been considered to be not a good thing, then the last thing you want to do is be called sensitive, because all those memories, all that maybe unconscious material that was negative to you has been associated with a very neutral word, sensitive, right?
Yeah.
It really is sensitive is more about sensory than it is about emotional reactivity or anything else. In fact, I wrote a blog article about sensitivity and what's wrong with the word gentle. I mean, what's wrong with the word sensitive. And I looked it up. I looked up a Webster's type definition for it. Nowhere in there was listed sensory processing sensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
It was frail or weak or overly emotional, whatever, those kind of terms. So that sort of is why so many people struggle with it. Now, with men, and even highly sensitive men, I've had highly sensitive men tell me, well, if I'm around a bunch of highly sensitive guys, I don't mind using the term. But if I'm at a place where there's a mixed crowd, I just can't see myself using it.
Right.
And so I think that's why there is a sort of a gentle movement, I like that, to sort of shift away from sensitive as a term that we refer to ourselves as, and moving it towards high sensory intelligence. This is something Dr. Tracy Cooper is working on with a few others. And the idea is to give it a much more positive sort of connotation than it's like we all know that there's nothing wrong with the word sensitive. It's just that if you throw it out in the world, it comes back with mud on it. I don't know why. It just does. So as we're getting people to understand about the trait and understand that it's a positive and understand that it's not a disorder, it's nothing to be ashamed of. Perhaps if we label it something, put a different candy wrapper on it, it'll be better in the long term, so that people could at least investigate and learn about it, understand it. And I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's like, it's like starting off with the wrong foot already when you're saying, because it would be helpful for us to maybe deal better with boundaries if we can say we are this and that, we are highly sensitive. But the minute you say highly sensitive, people are like, oh, okay, go deal with it. So having a term that is kind of neutral, I think would be more helpful, and it wouldn't take so much courage to actually say it. Like, introvert, it's almost like it had, in the beginning, it had a little bit of a bad connotation to it, but now it's more widely accepted. So maybe it just highly sensitive also needs to go through some kind of transformation in order to be more widely accepted and not be met with so much.
And speaking, because I know this is your area, is marketing, and sometimes the terminology makes a difference, right?
It does,
You just sometimes you wind up with a term that just isn't going to fly.
Yeah.
And even though you don't mean one thing or the other with it, it's how is it perceived by the world? If the world says, we're not going to embrace this, then you're fighting an uphill battle here. And I think sometimes just a little pivot and a little shift, which is what I think is happening here, then more people will open up to it.
It's funny that, I went through this with gentle to humane, and now we're having to do the same thing with highly sensitive.
Exactly.
It is really marketing the term, right? And I think it'll be only beneficial to all the highly sensitive people to have a term where they don't feel like they have to apologize. It's almost like you have to apologize for being that. Yeah.
Exactly. Here's the funny thing about it, though, is that it took me 10 years to get to the point where I could accept sensitive and not be ashamed to talk about it. When I was writing the book, I had to say something about, well, what are you writing a book about? And then it's like, there's this blank that hit my face. It's like, how do I describe this? So I just started saying it's a book about high sensitivity in men. And you could see the look on their face, and then I would immediately go in and explain and get a foothold with them before at some point almost everybody, male and female, would say, you know what, I know somebody like that. I have a cousin like that, or I have a brother like that, or I have a parent like that, or one of my kids. It becomes relatable then, right? And once you get them past that term, so I'm okay with whatever the direction is. If it wants to change the name, that's fine. I'm okay if it stays around for a number of years. I've gotten used to it now. I'm not afraid of it
You've done the
anymore.
work. Yeah, it's all about, doing the work and accepting it.
Yeah.
I think that's why, we're having this conversation under the P of personal power, because once you own it and you do the work, then it becomes your power. It becomes your superpower. Like at this workshop, I just went up to the host and I said, I'm not going to be participating in the evening workshops. It's too much for me. And she said, oh, I really applaud you for, being brave to show up and say that. And so it felt like being perceived in a good way, even though it did take me some courage to go up to her and be the only one who didn't want to,
What a great example. That was a great example, Sarah, of setting a boundary and standing up for yourself. That's what I think more highly sensitive people need to be okay with doing that kind of thing.
And the difficult part, I think, is that you need to learn to say no to the things that you want to do. It's easy to say no to the things we don't want to do,
right?
But it's harder to say no to the things that you actually would like to do. I know I was missing out on some of the events in the evening, but I needed to prioritize self-care before that. So
absolutely,
yeah.
And that is so key. That's so key to be able to do that.
Tell us more about your book before we wrap up here, Bill.
The first book, Confession of a Sensitive Man, it came out about a year or two ago. It was really my experiences of growing up as a highly sensitive man, some anecdotes from my life and that kind of thing. And I was trying to write a relatable book for men to read who could say, look, we may not have had exactly the same experiences, but I can relate to what you went through. The second book, the one that just recently came out, is more of a kind of a trail guide, is what I like to call it. I use a lot of metaphors for trails and hiking because I like doing that. But it's kind of a trail guide on being a sensitive man, dealing with some of the things, the challenges that we deal with, whether it's workplace or whether it's relationships or whether it's environment, having to sort of stand up for yourself, setting those boundaries and things like that. And some ideas on brain training, how to teach your mind to calm down, and things you can do to make your brain more resilient. So it's kind of a toolkit of things that I had discovered throughout the course of my life. The funny thing about my life is that I had been sampled so many different things, and I never understood at the time why I was doing that. Just all kinds of techniques and books and theories and so forth and so on. And it turns out that it was useful in helping me construct this book. So that's, even though you're doing stuff that you don't really get half the time, sometimes it'll come and play later on in life.
Yeah, it's that part, the connecting dots, right?
Exactly. That finally the dots make sense, right?
Yeah,
that's true.
Wonderful.
But anyway, that's kind of what the book is about. And it's also about my hopes of where we go from here.
And what's the title of the second one?
It's called On Being a Sensitive Man. And so it's about, now that we've established that we're sensitive men, how do we live with it? How do we deal with it? And how do we go forward and be proud of who we are?
So good. This has been absolutely fantastic. I could go on and on, tell you all about my specific examples, Will, but we need to wrap up. So I really, really appreciate your time here. I always have one last question, and that is, what are you grateful for today or this week, Bill?
Well, you know what? One of the things I guess I'm grateful for is all the wonderful people that I've met, on this journey so far. And every week, there's always somebody new that gets sort of added to the list. That shared experience is validating, especially if you're, stepping out on a limb and you're saying, talking about things that are sometimes difficult to deal with. Having a network of great people that are somehow connected to you, I'm super grateful for that.
Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. Me too. Like the podcast for this is one of the best things I've ever done for my business as an introvert and HSP, to just, dive right into it and go really deep. And then at night, allow myself to process and really digest the information as well. I think as a consequence of realizing that deep processing, I also just slowed down the podcasting and only release an episode every 2 weeks. Again, it's about boundaries and really feeling into it and saying, you know what, it's actually too much for me to kind of just, like a factory spit out these podcasts. I need to sit with the humans for a bit and really, go deeper.
Well, you're a real natural. I've enjoyed this conversation. I enjoyed speaking with you. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll speak again. Take care.
Alrighty.
Thanks so much for watching and being part of a generation of marketers who cares for yourself, for your clients, and for the planet. We really are change makers before we are marketers. So go ahead, be the change you want to see in the world. And I hope to see you again next week. Take care.